welcome to Relish Books. Today is my first book versus movie video, and I'm going to be talking about Little Women, book versus mini movies in this case, movies and miniseries. I'm only really going to be talking about the ones that I have seen, and I'm going to have to move them pretty quick because there are a lot. I feel like Little Women is a great place to start because to me, as I mentioned in my video leading up to this, it is the iconic book to movie book because it's been done so many times, maybe more than any other book. It has literally dozens of adaptations to movie, to television, to the stage, to musical, to opera, to radio drama, to anything you can think of. There's an anime series of it. The original, so the book, Little Women, was published in 1868. And then the first movie that I know of that I could find it's a lost movie. You can't find it anymore. But there was a movie, a black and white silent film made in 1917 that I think was the first Little Women movie, but the first that we tend to think of in our society, at least in my experience, the first movie that comes to mind as the real beginning of the Little Women movies is the 1933 version with Katharine Hepburn. And this is the first Little Women movie that I watched, and it set the stage for every main Little Women movie to follow. What is so interesting about Little Women book versus movie is the way in which the movie has taken on its own traditions. So I'm going to go through and just talk a little bit about some of the main plot points that happen in the movies and some of the big differences from the book. And then at the end, I'm going to say whether I think any of the movies, any of them, are better than the book, and if you should actually just skip all the movies and only read the book, and what I think about that. So, it's so hard to start because there's so many things. So, Little Women, the book, I have wondered why it is that this book in particular has been made into movies so many times. It's a really good book. I really like it, but why is it's not more amazing than a lot of other classics. I think there's a lot of nostalgia about it. I think there's a lot of girls in America particularly who grew up, a little while ago especially, who grew up reading this book and loving it. It's also a book that you might think would be difficult to turn into a movie, which I think is why the movies stray in a lot of ways from some of the things in the book, because it's really a book that's largely about day-to-day life with this family and the four sisters just growing up. And there's a lot of dramatic points. There's a lot of passages that lend themselves to drama. There's romance. There's, some of the classic scenes like Amy falling through the pond, the ice in the pond. That's big and dramatic. Amy burning Joe's book. There are these moments that have drama, but it's all wrapped up in this narrative of daily life. But I think that daily life feeling is what's so appealing to people, because you feel like, reading the book growing up, you feel like you're growing up with these girls. And the way that time passes and the way that their ages work is kind of indistinct, and it's kind of unimportant. It's always been interesting to me how Laurie, the next door neighbor, comes into the story, and when the girls are really kind of older, and yet in just a couple of years it gives the sense that he's always been part of their lives and he grew up with them and was with them all through their childhood. It's especially funny, like in the newest version of the movie, Amy makes the comment about how she's loved him her whole life, and that could seem kind of silly. It's like, well, she really hasn't known him anywhere near her whole life, but it gives that sense that he has been part of their life for a really long time, even though he didn't really come in until most of the girls were in their older teens. But even though they are in their teens, there is this sense of childhood and then growing up to adulthood. The book, one of the big differences, to start off with one of the big differences, the book is about Jo. The book, the centerpiece is Jo. You know, it's called Little Women, and various film adaptations have really tried to give more sympathy to the other sisters. The book would not be great, in my mind, if it wasn't for Jo. The other three sisters' characters are pretty weak as far as characters go. In my opinion, they're not well developed, they're not likable, they're just not great. Another thing that a lot of the movies do is kind of blend Jo March and Louisa May Alcott, because the book is somewhat autobiographical. The four sisters are kind of based on her and her three sisters. So particularly the newest movie is really drawing from what they know of Louisa May Alcott's life and blending it into Jo's life. So some of the things that are like, why is this is not something that's from the book, this is not an opinion that these people would have had, they were trying to put in what they think Louisa May Alcott's opinions would have been, to put in some of that. But I think part of the reason that the three other sisters are not very likable is honestly because they're based on her own sisters. And she tries to do Beth sympathetically. Beth is like the hardest character you could ever try to cast, which is why she's such a disaster of a character in most of the films. Very difficult character because she is this, you know, those saintly characters are really difficult. And Louisa May Alcott claimed that she wasn't like a saintly character. She was like, no, she's flawed. She's like anybody else. It's not true. She's a saintly character, one of those, you know, perfect people who has this otherworldliness about them because they're going to die. So a very difficult character to do and a difficult character to read. Her death is sweet and emotional. That's really the only good part you really get from her. Amy is a terrible and annoying character all the way through. And Louisa May Alcott's sister, who Amy was based on, actually said that she was not at all happy. She was like, I don't want that character to be based on me because she's terrible. I don't want that. That's not me. But Louisa May Alcott actually didn't get along with that sister the way that Jo doesn't get along with Amy. And so it's like she tried to have sort of a reconciliation and have Amy mature, but I think she still just didn't really have a great opinion of that sister. And so it wasn't authentic. Amy stays a very unpleasant character, at least for me. There's probably fans of her out there. Which is another thing that makes Amy's character one of the most interesting in some of the films. And then there's Meg, who I feel like Louisa May Alcott had the most sympathy towards as a sister, with who she loved but who was flawed. But she's not a well-done character to my mind either, except in the passages where it's talking about her married life. Some of those are really fun and insightful and sweet. But yeah, when she's a sister, it's constantly telling you how good she is, that she's a really good person, but it only shows you her flaws. It only shows you her struggles. It'll be like, she was a really good person, but she's struggling with this right now. It shows you her struggle, and that's all you see of her. So you only see the complaining, tired, having a bad time side of her character, unfortunately. And so kind of the whole tradition of what Little Women is all about being about four sisters, that warmth and family life isn't in the book as much as you might expect from watching some of the movies. So I just want to say that because, not to spoil things, but I actually think some of the movies improve on that. They take that idea of four sisters, these relationships, and they really make something better out of it than is actually in the book in the first place. But every single movie misses the greatness of the book because none of the movies have been able to cast Jo properly. She is the heart and soul of the book, particularly in the later parts of the book where she has matured. A lot of movies focus so much on the first part of Jo, before she really had developed her impetuous side, her tomboy side, her not wanting to be a woman, wishing she were a man. That whole thing is what is really focused on, and then they fail to really show her maturity other than that she gets like older and sadder after Beth's death. And a lot of their failure in this is that they also don't usually do Mr. Bear very well, and they don't do his relationship to Jo properly. So the shining moments of the book, Jo's whole character, which is complex and funny and interesting, no one has been able to portray that properly. Not a single actress has been able to get really the essence of who Jo is properly. And most of them miss the real depth of her relationship with Mr. Bear. He's usually just kind of thrown in there at the end because Jo didn't get with Laurie. She has to get with somebody, and that's an outrage to the character of who Mr. Bear is and what he was in Jo's life. So yeah, I am not one of those people who wishes Jo had gotten with Laurie. I would be if Mr. Bear wasn't so amazing and so perfectly complimenting to Jo's character and so right for her. If he was any less of a character, I would wish that Jo had gotten with Laurie, because I have never been happy that Jo got with Amy in the book. Because Laurie's a great character. Kind of opposite of Jo, I like Laurie's younger self a lot better than his older self. He changes, and for me, his change, he just gets kind of boring. Maybe that sounds shallow. I know he did mature, but it doesn't work well for me that he gets with Amy, because she's just not a great character in the book. I know that some of his tendencies, like for refinement and high society, were met better in her. She's a better complement to him. But to me, those are kind of his worst qualities. And I just don't like her as a person. And there is this sense, even though she does it pretty well, pulls it off pretty well in the book, there is this sense of like, Jo said no, Meg got married, Beth died, Amy is literally the only March sister left, and Laurie can't be with anybody but a March sister, so he has to get with Amy, and she has to make it work. I mean, Jo literally says Amy's left for him. And, yeah, I mean, I guess I'm happy that he got with a March sister rather than going off and being with somebody totally different, because that kind of would have ruined everything, but Amy is not right for him in the book. The way that the romance kind of comes about, it works to a certain extent in the moment, but when you look back at everything that they have been, it's just, if she was better done, it would be great. And one of the movies does do an amazing job with that, which I'll talk about in a little bit. So, starting with the movies, 1933, Katharine Hepburn. There are good moments in all of these movies, and all of these movies and miniseries get a different component right. None of them, not one, get nearly all the components right, but it's like each one gets a different thing right. Weird as this sounds, because if you've watched it, Katharine Hepburn's performance of Jo is so incredibly over the top and wild. And yet, I'm going to say that I really think, as far as trying to be true to the character of Jo, I really think Katharine Hepburn was actually the best casting choice, especially from all those older movies. If you look at some of these other casting choices, they were just not right. Winona Ryder in particular, from the 1994. That's a ridiculous casting choice. Jo is supposed to be tall and angular, and her one beauty is her hair. She's tomboyish, she's wild. Winona Ryder's like the littlest, prettiest, most feminine actress you can imagine. She is the absolute opposite of what you should ever get to play Jo. Katharine Hepburn is really good, or has a lot of potential, because she was considered beautiful, but she's very unusual. Like, she's very angular, and she has that quickness of going from being like awkward to being graceful and to being wild to being gentle. She really has the potential of being a great Jo and of showing the beginning part of her character to her later development, but she was overplayed. If you've seen Katharine Hepburn in anything, you know that that's just how she always is. She's one of those actresses that no matter who she's playing, she's always playing Katharine Hepburn. She's kind of always the same, always overacting. That's just her. That's just who she is. And so it's too much. She's too over the top, a little too crazy. But I do think that she's a good choice, and for in a lot of ways the best casting choice that there's ever been for Jo. It still just is not. It's kind of like a caricature of some of Jo's qualities, and it misses out on some of her depth. And again, nobody's ever really been able to get the heart of Jo, to get who she really is. You have to read the book. But the 1933 version set the stage for all the movies to follow. It really feels like all the movies coming after, instead of taking the book as their model, they took that movie as their model for their movie. It was like every other movie after that was a remake of that movie, with using the book as like a supplement to add some things, change some things. Really using that movie as a model rather than the book is how it feels to me, because the 1949 version with June Allyson feels like a little bit more moderated remake of the Katharine Hepburn movie. It's a little more toned down. June Allyson does a decent job. It feels like she is trying to imitate Katharine Hepburn rather than trying to be Jo. With not as good success, except that she's a little more toned down. Again, she doesn't get the essence of Jo, but she's pretty good. I know some people who really like this performance and this version. I don't like it for a lot of reasons. I don't like Laurie. He's like a heartthrob of the time with no character. They cast Elizabeth Taylor as Amy just to cast her. She's awful. No character or acting ability. Margaret O'Brien? No. Anyway, little girl to play Beth, so they swapped their ages on that. Don't even remember Meg. Meg is pretty forgettable in most of these movies. All that being said, it is a fairly enjoyable movie to watch. And both that one and the Katharine Hepburn one are pretty heavy on humor. They try to make it funny. Both these movies also have a very elderly, pretty nice-ish Mr. Bear. He's fine, but again, not the character that he's supposed to be. And I guess since I mentioned him, I will talk about another one of the biggest problems, book to movie. I think the number one biggest problem for me, apart from Jo's just character, which you can't really blame them too much because she would be a very hard character to portray. So apart from just Jo's character, the biggest problem with every single film adaptation is that Mr. Bear reads Jo's work, criticizes her, and she gets angry about it, and there's a breach in their relationship. And then later, he reads her other work and kind of comes back and like gives her affirmation of it. I cannot emphasize this enough. That never happens in the book. And it's very, very important that that never happens because it just changes everything. Something a little bit similar does happen, and it's totally different. Her getting angry at him is just, it's so offensive. It's so wrong to who these characters are. So Jo has been writing in these trashy magazines, just like in the movies. She's been writing these sensational, gory stories. And she and Mr. Bear are friends. They're staying in the place together. They've become really good friends. She is not thinking about him romantically at all. He has always liked her, but she's not thinking about him in that way. But she deeply, deeply respects him as a friend. Like a deep respect and admiration. Mr. Bear knows that Jo is a writer, and he has some idea from the landlady, I think, that she writes like these sensational stories. He has an idea of this. But he sees this other magazine that has a similar kind of story, not one that she wrote. And he kind of takes that opportunity to gently, he's so gentle and so kind in the way that he does this, but also firm, because it's not that he knows more and he's criticizing her. He believes in her and knows that she could do better, and he trusts her to take his advice. It's just a beauty and intricacy and depth of relationship that all the movies completely blow by having this confrontation and anger between them. So he sees this other magazine. He says something along the lines that he would rather, give children poison to drink than that they would read this garbage. Something like that. He criticizes this kind of writing. Jo's embarrassed because she knows it's the kind of writing that she does. She says something somewhat in its defense. She mostly just gets kind of embarrassed and kind of changes the subject. And he's like, no, this stuff is wrong and it's bad. Jo goes back to her room. Here's the other thing. It wasn't like he's pointing something out from his wisdom that she is, that she's less than him or something like that. She knows that it was wrong. She knows that her stories were not what she should have been doing and that she could do better. But because of making money, she's just kind of brushed aside her conscience and hasn't been paying attention to this. So she goes back to her room, reads through some of her stuff, realizes with horror that it's as terrible as the story that Mr. Bear was talking about. She burns all of her writing and she stops writing until she can write something better. And Mr. Bear sees this. He notices that she is not writing anymore. He doesn't say anything about it. He just knows that and is glad because his trust in her was justified. And this strengthens and deepens their relationship rather than causing a breach. The other thing, I believe there might have been one of the miniseries might have done it where he didn't actually read her story. And it was kind of the scenario that I just said. I can't remember, but here's something that I'm pretty sure every single one of them has done, with the exception of the newest movie, I think, where her book hadn't come out yet. That he reads her book and then comes back and tells her how great it is. That also never happened partly because in the book it was a piece of her writing that brought him back, not because it was good writing, but because it was an insight into her heart and he thought that maybe she could use a friend in that moment in her life. Because in the book, another big difference, Jo didn't write a novel at the end of the story. She had started writing stories that were being published in better magazines. She was writing some poetry. She was gaining ground as a writer, but it wasn't like she wrote this novel about their lives, which is how most of the movies choose to make it go, which I kind of understand as a plot point. Particularly in the newest one, they really emphasize that she was the author of Little Women. Again, where I think they're really switching up her identity as Jo with that of Louisa May Alcott. So I kind of understand that, but this idea that he reads her writing and is now approving of it, that she needs his affirmation, that's not in the book at all, and it annoys me that they do it repeatedly throughout the movie, because I think the first one did it and they're like, oh, that's a good plot point, so we're all gonna do it forever. That's a terrible, terrible mistake. And again, him reading her later work and being like, oh, that's really good, that doesn't bother me as much as the whole him criticizing her and her taking it like a spoiled child. That's so annoying, and I hate that. Anyway, moving on. That's one of the big book versus movie problems. But moving on to 1970 miniseries. This is a very little known miniseries. When I was trying to look it up because I couldn't remember who the actors were, and it was giving me two other miniseries, one of which I've watched, the newer one with Maya Hawke. That was in 2017, and another one that I have yet to watch with Susan Dey from 1978. It was giving me those two, but it was not wanting to give me this I think it was a BBC version from 1970. I think the world really wants to forget that it happened, and I don't blame them because it's a really, really stinky one on like every level. It actually followed the book more closely in a lot of ways, but here's another thing about books versus movies. Sometimes just because a book or just because a movie follows a book closely doesn't mean it's good. It's all about the acting and the portrayals of the characters, and all of the sisters in this movie were horrendous. This is the 1970 version with Angela Down playing Jo, and she's awful. Not just her acting, it's not even really her acting, it's her portrayal. There have been a lot of interesting portrayals of Jo throughout all of Little Women history. Hers is really weird because she plays a very, Jo is known for her temper. It's a problem that she has. It's something that's in the book. It's something that is in all of the movies. She has a quick, hot temper. It's part of her character. It causes her problems, and she has to grow through that. This portrayal of Jo is a very angry Jo, all the time. And she's not just angry. Jo's anger in the book is more of an impetuous nature. She is quick to anger, but she's also very quick to love. And to friendship. She's a jolly person. Like Louise May Alcott, the quote, I've had a lot of troubles, so I write jolly tales. Jo is at heart supposed to be a jolly person. And this portrayal, Angela Down did such a bitter version of, even before Beth died, but afterward, when Jo, was struggling with grief, this character in this show, they decided to really take it to a different level, and she was very angry and very bitter. And it's such a shame because there are a couple good things about this show, one of them being Mr. Bear is actually really good, but his goodness and his the way that his character is portrayed, he's a good version, but he's completely wasted because Jo's so awful. You're like, this good guy should not be with this awful girl. He should run away. He should not like her. He should not be with her. She treats him like dirt, and she's an awful person. I'm probably exaggerating, but that's the way I remember it. Didn't like any of the other sisters either. The one truly great character from this show is the father, who's basically non-existent in all of the movies and series and in the book. Very small character. He's a father that's not really there even after he comes home from the war. He's not an involved part of their lives. He's written about with love and respect. A lot of people, say that Louise May Alcott was representing her own father, who was also an absent, kind of neglectful father because of all the things he was interested in doing, his beliefs, all that. This particular interpretation decided, instead of just being making it how it is in the book, that he's a completely absent father, and instead of just passing it off that's fine, he's still good, they all love him, this movie this show actually decided to address that. He kind of comes to a realization of how absent he's been and tries to turn around and be a better father. And he's a good actor, and I just thought that was really, really sweet. It doesn't happen in the book, but I wish that it did. And that's a change that I enjoyed seeing. But unfortunately, it's in a terrible show, so don't recommend that one. But he's a cool dad. The Winona Ryder, 1994. Again, Winona Ryder is an absolutely ridiculous choice for Jo. Horrible. And Christian Bale as Laurie is also ridiculous. He can be a good actor, but his acting in this is just weird. Don't like it at all. This version did the thing where they have Amy as a young, different actress when she's young, and then it swaps out when she's older. That makes sense because if they don't do that, they have to have an adult playing a little girl, which usually doesn't work great. But unfortunately, the young Amy, played by Kirsten Dunst, is actually pretty good. She does a good job as young Amy, but once she swaps to another actress, there was no connection. It just felt like she was a totally different person. The swapping out just did not work. And then it's especially weird when Laurie's like falling in love with her, because it's like, we don't even know who this person is, and she's not very good. So, yeah. But with all the problems with that movie, and there's a ton of problems with that movie, a ton, the relationship with Mr. Bear is even more. They went ahead and did, because when Jo is first with Mr. Bear, she's only thinking of him as a friend. She has no thought for a romance. They really changed that around in this one, and they full on have a romance. And it's interesting. He's a very different portrayal of Mr. Bear. He is even older than he's supposed to be, I feel like. A very different tone of person. And again, having this kind of like, that they're open about this romantic interest really changes things. But I'm kind of embarrassed to say, I actually kind of enjoy the romance in this one. I enjoy the actor, and I think it's kind of sweet, even though I don't like Winona Ryder. It is kind of weird because you're watching it and you're like, what? None of this is supposed to happen. Like, they kiss and he's hanging out like with her in her room. It feels weird. Because yeah, that's not supposed to happen, but it is kind of sweet. But yeah. And I know this sounds weird to say, but it's important. I like their house in this one. The setting of the movies is important because one of the main things that the movies are really relying on is this sense of family and of comfort and coziness that's in the house when all the family is together, and then kind of departs when they're dispersed and this loneliness comes to the house. I love just the feeling of the house, of their home, the attic in particular. It had this warmth and coziness that made me like the movie and kind of enjoy the feeling that it gave me, even though it's not a good interpretation of the book at all. And I didn't like the casting choices. So that's what I got for that one. 2017, the Maya Hawke miniseries. I hated it. It's bad in pretty much every level. The acting is atrocious. It's awkward and cringy. Yeah. Blech. I know some people love it. And no shame to them. It has some of the same problems that all the other ones have, where she gets angry at Mr. Bear, blah, 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 blah. Kind of follows the same old pattern, but I don't know. Some people like it. It is closer to the book than some of the others, I guess. But I hated the acting of everybody. So that kind of puts a damper on it. And now we come to the newest movie, the one that most people are going to be familiar with. And this is the hardest one to talk about. I know I'm already half an hour into the video, but with this many movies to talk about, it kind of just has to be long. This is so hard. This is the hardest one because in a lot of ways, this movie, the Saoirse Ronan movie, is the most different from the book. And it's the biggest one where they really were trying to tell Louisa May Alcott's story, and they blended her so closely together with Jo to the point where it's like Jo is writing the story and narrating it to the point where, I don't know if other people felt this way, but at the end of the movie, I actually questioned whether the story was real or if it was just a book that she was writing. Particularly one of the final scenes where Jo says that her main character doesn't end up with the guy, and then her publisher convinces her to change her mind on that, because that is what happened with Little Women and Louisa May Alcott. She was not going to have Jo end up married, but her publishers persuaded her. Which is interesting because the romance with Mr. Bear is amazing. That chapter, Under the Umbrella, is one of the best written chapters in literary history. If you have not read that chapter, you need to read the entire book just to read it. It's its sweetness, its comedic timing, its perfect showing of who these people are and their interactions with each other, perfect culmination of an entire book and the development of two characters. It is a masterpiece of a chapter. So it's funny that originally she wasn't gonna have that happen. And I'm not sure at what point in the writing stages this discussion was going on. But anyway, the new movie, it really does blend Louisa May Alcott with Jo, and you have to take that into consideration when you're watching it, otherwise the movie will make less sense. Some people have also said that the movie is very confusing because of the way that it's shot with back and forth the time jumps. You'll have a scene that's in the present, and then you'll have a scene from the past. You'll have a scene that's in the present, and you'll have a scene from the past. I know some people found this confusing. I actually like it because, well, in Little Women, there are two distinct halves. There's the first half of the book, and there's the second half of the book. And in a lot of the movies, and this is the way it is, they grew up. But the second half just has this feeling of sadness, like all the happy, carefree days are over. Because they are, That's legitimate. But I liked that the movie did this back and forth thing because then you have those glowing, happy times throughout the movie. It's not, you have this first half of the movie where they're joyous and carefree and they're getting into all their troubles and struggles as sisters, all these things. And then you have the second half of the movie where they're all kind of separated and going their different ways. I really like that, the swapping back and forth, and I didn't find it confusing particularly because of the lighting. You'll notice that all of the present day shots are very gray and cold toned, and all the shots from the past are very vibrant and very warm toned. And so as soon as it swaps, you can tell just from the coloring. So I like that. There's a couple weird things in the shooting. There's a couple times when characters talk directly to the camera, which is really weird and out of place. I think the makers of the movie were just trying to be revolutionary in some ways. That one did not work. It's a stupid choice, but it only happens a few times. There are so many problems with this movie. So many problems. I could just go on and on and on. I mentioned it in a different video that I made when I mentioned the movie. There are always casting problems in every Little Women movie. And the huge glaring casting problem in this movie is Marmee. Laura Dern is just awful. She's an awful actress. And these beautiful scenes of the girls at home, she just puts a damper on it because anytime she says something, you cringe because it's awful. She's a horrible, horrible actress. Yeah. It's hard for me to even watch the movie knowing she's in it because she's so bad. But also Mr. Bear, interesting choice. He's way too young, but I don't think it's so much a casting choice as a choice in what they decided to do with the story because they really changed his character. So he's not like a bad actor. They just kind of changed it. I complained enough already about the changes they made to Mr. Bear. It's a huge problem in this movie, but I'm not really going to mention it that much because I already talked about it. They did all the same problems that they do with him, but even worse in this one. But he's a fine actor. So yeah, this movie has a myriad of problems. I hate the scene where Laurie is like drinking at the party. This is very early on, a scene with him and Amy. It felt like they really deliberately did this, that he's drinking. That's important because in the book, he makes a promise to Meg at her wedding that he won't drink. And this is something that's really, really fundamental to his character. It might seem like a small thing. Meg didn't approve of it, and she asks him to promise her. She's like, it's my wedding day. Promise me you won't drink. And it's a little difficult for him. He's like, because, that's kind of a big thing to promise. Because he promises, like, for the rest of his life. But he made that promise. And it distinctly points out that promise kind of saved him later in life because when he's down in despair, he doesn't turn to alcohol because of a promise he made to Meg, which is also important because it shows the relationship and the respect that Laurie had for all the sisters, even for Meg, who you really don't see a ton of interaction between him and her. And it really felt like this movie just like purposely put that in to kind of fly in the face of the scene in that book. I don't know if that was the purpose, but it felt very deliberate because the book very clearly points out that even when Laurie was at his darkest time, he didn't turn to alcohol because of the promise he made to Meg. So that bothered me. There's a lot of things like that. Again, there's so many problems with the movie, so many differences, so many changes, but in a lot of ways, this movie is better than the book. And I think anyone who's seen it knows why. All the movies have casting problems, but the most important casting is always going to be the four sisters. And this movie somehow made such incredible casting choices for the four girls that their relationships and their characters are better than the book. Not Jo. She, again, is not the person that she is in the book. Not really. Nobody's ever gotten her right. I don't think anybody ever will. But Saoirse Ronan brought her own, like they always do. She kind of brought her own interpretation to it, and it works. She's not really Jo from the book, but she's a good character, and she works well with the other girls, and she has a lot of Jo's spirit. So she works good, and I like her, even though she's maybe not like Jo from the book. But hey, nobody is. But the other three girls, all three of them, are vast improvements on the characters that are in the book. Maybe some people are going to disagree with me, but I don't even know how they did this, to where they brought the spirit of the sisters from the book. It feels like that, and yet made them so much better. The relationships, the good chemistry of the relationships they have is something that doesn't even exist in the book. And yet these feel like the characters from the book. They have the pivotal scenes that they do. And I gotta say, I think the writing is amazing, for one thing. Dialogue is really great for the most part. But just the acting. And the most amazing one to me, you could make an argument that any of the three of them are the best, I think. Meg, who, it's like it takes all her good qualities that are kind of hinted at in the book that you don't really see, and she embodies them. She's warm and loving. She's just like, she's the oldest sister. She has housewifely passions and dreams, and she just portrays that in a gentle and beautiful way. And she's also like Jo's best friend, which is something that the book kind of says, but you don't really see. And they brought that to life in such a natural and beautiful way. So Meg's amazing. Beth, a character that nobody has ever been able to play well because she's supposed to be so good. One of the miniseries, sometimes they try to counteract that. One of the miniseries, the one with Maya Hawke as Jo, that Beth, they tried, I think, to make her more realistic by making her be like impatient and snappy at times. Made her more of a difficult child. Kind of tried to bring out some of the badness in her, and it just didn't work. She just wasn't a good character. This Beth, I don't even know how she does it. She's amazing. She's funny is the thing. I think the girls bringing humor, and humor that worked, to the film is really what made it. Just their delivery and their timing and their tones of voice, the way they interact with each other. She's really funny. She's really sweet. And she's just a really great Beth. She's a Beth that you actually like, which is such an achievement. So Meg and Beth are amazing. But, and I think most people will agree, Amy is the star of this movie. I think everybody knows it. Everybody who watches it knows. Florence Pugh's performance just stole the show of the whole movie, which is so amazing because Amy in the book is the worst sister, worst character. And they took who she was. It wasn't like they just completely changed her character. They took who she was, her dialogue, the things that she did, the terrible things that she did, put them in the movie. But with that actress, She is funny. She's lovable. I don't know. I don't even know how to really describe it. She's just an amazing actress. A portrayal of Amy that will never be matched. And then I think the most important thing with her character is the transition that she makes. None of the other actresses have been able to pull this off, where they went from like the spoiled brat child to a mature, likable woman. And I think part of her success in doing this is that as a spoiled brat child, you still didn't hate her. Like Amy in the book and Amy in some of the other adaptations, she's so terrible, you just hate her. You don't like her at all. Somehow, I think because she's so funny, she makes you love her even when she is terrible. I mean, even in the scene where she burns Joe's book, which is one of the most emotional and traumatic parts of the entire movie, and something that most of the time you just makes you hate Amy so much. Like, you feel with Joe, you're completely on Joe's side, and it just kind of makes you hate Amy. Even in that scene, you don't dislike her because she is acting it so well. I'm not saying, like, you're still on Joe's side and you're still horrified at what she's doing, but the actress she does it so well that it doesn't destroy her as a character. And you sympathize with her. You actually see her side of things so much better. And then I think because you don't hate her as a child and you see more depth in her than just her actions and just her spoiled behavior, you see depth in her. And then I think that's what works to bringing it through to maturity. She's believable as an adult woman. She's believable, and something that didn't work in the book, doesn't work in any other version, her romance with Laurie actually works. And I'm kind of mixed on how I feel about Laurie in the movie. I think he's all right. I think he's pretty good. And his romance with Joe felt the most really like from the book of any version that I've seen, where you really feel like, yeah, they should just be friends and he shouldn't be trying to get with her, even though they act it really well and he acts being in love with her fine. You're like, yeah, they should just be friends. And then his romance with Amy is like, yes, that's who he should be with. And it's satisfying, it's fulfilling, and it actually makes you happy. And for that reason, I think the newest movie, even though in some ways, actually a lot of ways, it is the most different from the book, it's the best movie. It just has to be, because the four main characters are actually good. So, those are my thoughts. There's a lot more that I could say. There's so much to be said about all of these, all kinds of little differences. Honestly, the entire tone of the book is very different to me than the tone that any of the movies make. So, read the book. Make sure you read the book. It's a different thing from the movies, but the movies are worth watching. The newest one in particular, some of them are not worth watching. None of the miniseries that I've seen were any good. If you're just kind of interested in Little Women history, I think the Katharine Hepburn one can be kind of fun, but it is pretty awkward and cringy. It's very over the top. But if you're looking for a movie that maybe isn't quite like the book, but is really good, solid portrayal of family and nostalgia, particularly if you're like a woman who has sisters. I have sisters, and the relationships between the sisters in this movie make it extra emotional, but I think you can connect to it even if you don't, because the performances are just stupendous of those four. It has tons of problems, tons of cringy moments, awkward stuff. Marmie's awful, the father's awful, but again, he's non-existent pretty much. Mr. Bear isn't great. But it's a movie that's actually about four little women, and they are amazing. Really, really beautiful portrayals from them. So that's why I would recommend that movie, even though it is not much like the book. So those are my thoughts on book versus movie. I'm not going to say any of the movies are actually better than the book because they're so different. But particularly about that last movie, there are things about it that are better. So, you got to do both. Book and movie. So, those are my thoughts. This is my longest video to date, so I do not blame you if you didn't make it all the way through. But if you did, yeah, thank you so much. And I will see you next time.